Well, you're welcome anyway.
Okay. All right. Let's see. It says that it's recording from the last class. Good. So now we will start a new recording, and I will bring up Megillah. I just got to find it here. Let's see.
You have a busy morning.
Yeah, I have to be better about doing the first class just in 45 minutes so I can stop and organize.
Well, if I don't participate, you will be able to do that.
Yeah, if you would stop asking all of your annoying questions. Okay, let's see. All right. We are going to, no, that's not what I want. I need to go to, okay, I'll find it. I know it's in here somewhere. There. Aha, okay. I just got to get to the right page. Let's see.
Rabbi, your emails for these classes didn't have actually a link, just told us what the codes were. The numbers.
Oh, it didn't have, it should have had the link.
Wait, what link for what?
To get into this Zoom meeting.
Something did.
Because you just clicked on a link and you got in?
Yeah.
Did you say yes?
Yes, I think at least two of the emails.
Oh, see, I just looked at I think the most recent one.
Oh,
and I couldn't see a link.
Uh,
I just used the numbers to
yeah.
the ID number and the passcode number and go to zoom.com, and then I put those in.
Why is this having me a hard time? Let's see. How do I want to do this? Hold on here. I know there's a way to do this. Like before. Maybe I want to do this. Oh, I know what I did. Okay, wait. I have to open it. That's where it is. Okay. There is aha! Now I got it. All right. All right, so we're going to open up. We're going to go down to, I don't know what page it is, but it's getting there.
The email with notes number 4 had a link, and I think an earlier one did.
All right, well, here we go. We're just got to find the right page.
And you use the same Zoom link for the whole class? I mean, every week again?
Yeah. So, almost there. Here we go. I have to memorize what page it's on. What's it? 192? Okay. 192. Here we go. Page 190.
The actual text is 195.
195. There we go. All right.
192, I think, is the introductory stuff.
Okay.
What text are you looking at?
All right. Well, I'm going to show it in 1 second. Once I get. Oh man. Okay. Here we go. All right. Now we're going to share screen. And it is, you should be able to see Mishnah.
Okay, this is the hard copy of the book.
Yeah.
But it's also available as PDF.
Right. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to have the PDF up on the screen. So, and you can purchase the PDF. They sell the PDF. It's very inexpensive, like $10. Although some people like to learn from a book. But here we're going to begin. So you can see this, right? It says Mishnah, Parak, Daf 2.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So here's Megillah, and the tractate of Megillah. The focus of the tractate is the reading of the Megillah on Purim. The Megillah, what we're referring to, of course, is the book of Esther. There are, when we talk about Megillot, a Megillah is a scroll. So so they're actually in the books that we use for reading on the holidays. That book, that Sensino book that we use, that says the Chamesh Megillot, the 5 Megillot. So the Megillah was a scroll, and these books of the Torah that were read on particular holidays were all referred to as a Megillah because they were written on separate scrolls, separate from the Torah scroll that you were reading. And there was a Megillah for each holiday. Passover, we read Song of Songs. We just finished Sukkot. Sukkot is Ecclesiastes, Kohelet. And the Megillah for Purim is the Book of Esther, obviously, because that's the one that tells the story of the Book of Esther. I mean, of Esther and Mordechai. So the Mishnah of Megillah, which was written the Mishnah was finally compiled, edited in the very, very beginning of the 3rd century of the Common Era, describes when it talks about the reading of the Megillah and when it's read. It doesn't really talk about the scroll itself, doesn't talk about the content, but it's about when the scroll can be read. Because remember, the Mishnah is kind of a code, not exactly, but it's a little bit like a code to give the readers, the learners, an understanding of the practical, the halacha of the holiday or whatever. So the most important aspect of Purim is the reading of the Megillah, and that's how we begin. And it turns out that while Purim falls on the 14th of Adar, and Shushan Purim, what we call Shushan Purim, we'll see that that's almost a misnomer. The day that the Megillah is read in certain walled cities from the time of Joshua is the 15th, but we're going to see that you can read the Megillah on more than the 14th or the 15th. There are days when you can read it when it's read on the 11th, the 12th, or the 13th. And I think, as I put in my notes, that I think one of the reasons why you wouldn't say, I'm trying to think of, you wouldn't say the book of Jonah, which is the book we read on Yom Kippur. Well, you can read that on any day. No, you read it on Yom Kippur, right? And the Torah portions that are assigned to holidays, you read on those days. You don't say, well, you could read it another day if it's not possible. But the Megillah is read on, we're told, has different days. And I think that's partially because since it's not Torah, you have a little more leeway. And since the Megillah is the key to reading, the key element to the celebration or the remembrance, we'll call it, of Purim, you want the most people to hear the Megillah read. And that's what this opening is about, this first Mishnah. So the Mishnah begins, Megillah nikreit be'echad asar, b'shnei asar, b'shlosha asar, b'arba asar, b'chamisha asar. Lo pachot v'lo yoter. So it's read on, it can be read on the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, or the 15th, not before then and not after then. Krachin hamukafin choma mimot Yoshua ben Nun horin b'chamisha asar. Cities, now here we get a little confusing because they use a lot of different terms for cities, towns, villages, and it's not always the same. The Talmud uses a different term for some of these cities than the Mishnah does. So this gets a little bit confusing. But here, Krachin, at least at this point, is understood. See, he translated it as cities that have been surrounded by a wall. Read it on the 15th. From the time of Joshua ben Nun, we're going to have to discover that, why Joshua ben Nun? What does he have to do with the holiday of Purim? Kfarim ve'ayarot, so they translated here as villages and large towns. Ir is a city, so it gets a little confusing, but here they're translated as villages and large towns, ayarot gedolot, korin barbasar. So the people in villages and cities read it on the 14th. Ela shehakfarim makdimim liyom haknisa. But kfarim, so kfarim are smaller than ayarot gedolot. Kfarim, villages, can move it up to the day, literally the day of assembly, which is usually understood as market day, Monday or Thursday, when rabbinical courts are in session, the Torah is read publicly, and villagers therefore come to the larger towns.
Is some of this in Aramaic? It ends in nun instead of mem for plurals?
Oh, that's just an ancient, no, this is all Hebrew. The Mishnah is in Hebrew, and those are just some ancient forms of plural. Sometimes it's with the mem, sometimes it's with the nun. So Kate Sad, how does this work? You just told us it could be read on different days. So how does that work? So if the 14th of Adar falls on the second day of the week, which is Monday, kfarim ba'ayarot gedolot korim bo bayom. They would read it on the day, on that 14th, because those are the days even the people from the villages are coming into the bigger cities on Mondays. So everybody reads that, no problem. Umukafin choma lemachar, and walled cities would read it on the next day, which is the 15th. Chal lehiyot bashlishi or baravi'i, if the 14th of Adar falls on the third day or the fourth day of the week, that's Tuesday or Wednesday, kfarim makdimim liyom haknisa. People who live in kfarim, these villages, would advance the reading to the day of assembly, that market day, that day that the rabbinical courts are in session. The ayarot gedolot korim bo bayom. So, but the people in the big cities would still read it on the 14th. They would still read it on the 14th. And the mukafin choma on the 15th. So what you have here is, I mean, I guess the image that they're describing, and of course, we don't do this anymore. So this is, so we have to imagine that if you lived in a village and Purim fell on Tuesday, and you're coming in with your, and I have to assume here also when we say villages, we're talking about the agricultural centers. So it's like the market, it's like the farmer's market, right? They're bringing their produce to the bigger city on Monday or Thursday. And so they would come to the synagogues that day and hear the public reading of the Megillah on Monday. But then on Tuesday, you would read the Megillah again. And because the people who live in large towns don't need to hear it on Monday, they can hear it on Tuesday. They would celebrate it on the day of Purim. And then walled cities, the same thing. Now, then we continue, Chal lehiyot b'chamishi, once again, if the Purim fell on Thursday, Farim v'ayarot gedolot korim bo bayom, they would read it on the 14th, like normal, and mukafim choma lemachar, on the 15th, which would be Friday. Chal lehiyot erev Shabbat, but what if the 14th, if Purim falls on the 14th, which is Friday, Purim falls on erev Shabbat, which is Friday, kfarim makdimim liyom haknisa, the kfarim advance it to a market day, Thursday. Ayarot gedolot umukafot choma korim bo bayom. In this case, the big cities read it on the appropriate day, the 14th, which is Friday, but the walled cities, they read it on the 14th as well. They don't read it on the 15th. Why? Because 15th is Shabbat. And we don't read the Megillah, as we'll learn. We don't read it on Shabbat.
So why don't we read it on Shabbat? That was something.
we're going to get to that. It's the same explanation as why we don't bench lulav on Shabbat, why we don't blow shofar on Shabbat. There's this concern with carrying the Megillah in public. So therefore, for that reason, because it's Shabbat and we don't carry on Shabbat, we don't read the Megillah on that day. But the Gemara will explain that to us. Chal lechiyot b'Shabbat. Well, what happens if Purim falls on Shabbat? Kfarim va'ayarot gedolot makdimim b'korin liyom ha'knisa. Now here, this is interesting. According to the Mishnah, if it falls on Shabbat, if Purim falls on Shabbat, not only the villagers, but the big city move it up to Thursday. They don't read it on Friday, the day before. They move it up 2 days. So everybody moves it up to the market day, that Thursday, and a walled city reads it on its appropriate day, the 15th, which would be Sunday. Chal lehiyot achar Shabbat. So now, if it falls on Sunday, kfarim makdimim liyom ha'knisa. The villages advance to Thursday, which would be the 11th of Adar. So that's the earliest you can read it. The big cities read it on the appropriate day. There's no problem with reading it on Sunday. And the walled cities read it on the 15th, which would be Monday. So that's the Mishnah's teaching.
Purim falls on which day normally?
Oh, it can fall on any day of the week.
I mean, what day of the month?
Oh, the 14th. The 14th.
And is the reason we're going into this amount of detail on this subject just because it's next in line? Or, I mean, obviously it doesn't seem to be all that, doesn't seem to connect to our lives right now.
Oh, right. Well, that's true. But at the time of the Mishnah, this is what they would have done. They would have read on these different days of the week. As we get into the Gemara, it'll explain. There is a point where they explain that today we don't do it that way. But of course, these are, if the Mishnah is a sacred text and the Mishnah is explaining how it was done at that time, then the Gemara is going to take it, I don't know if the right word is seriously, but the Gemara is going to try to explain how the Megillah is understanding this.
And the word Megillah, you said there are Megillahs for other holidays. What does that mean?
Well, a Megillah is just a scroll.
Oh.
But in this case, the Megillah that we're referring to is the Megillah of the Book of Esther. Because that's the only, I was going to say that's different from the other Megillot, because the other Megillot, the ones we read on Purim, on Pesach, on Shavuot, on Sukkot, Tisha B'Av, those scrolls are not the essence of the celebration of the holiday. The book of the holiday of Purim, the essence is really the reading of the Megillah. So that's why the focus here is on the Megillah and not on the other aspects of celebration for Purim, which there are. There are other mitzvot, but the main essence of the holiday is hearing the Megillah read. So here we begin the Gemara. The Gemara is going to now take the Mishnah and look at it more deeply. Megillah nikret be'echad asar. The Megillah is read on the 11th and then all the other days. Minalan. Where does that come from? So they wants to know, where do we derive that halakha that it can be read on these other days? And the response is, wait a minute, Minalan. Kibida'enan lemeimar lekaman. We're going to intend to talk about it later on in the Gemara. Chachamim hekelu al hakfarim lihiyot makdimim liyom haknisa kedei sheyisapku mayim umazon la'achechem shabakrachim. Okay, the sages were lenient with villages, and they allowed them to advance the reading of the Megillah to the day of assembly, so that they would be free to supply water and food to their brethren in the cities on the day of Purim. So the Megillah is read on the 11th, even though, because the question, the essence of the question is, where did you get the idea that if the holiday is on the 14th, you read it on the 11th? And the answer is because the villages, these smaller cities that are probably, the way I understand it, they're the suppliers of food. It's the farmers market. So they're bringing water, they're bringing other foods in to sell to the people in the cities. And if we didn't allow them to bring their stuff on that market day, then on the 14th, which is when the cities are going to read, they wouldn't have the food and the produce to celebrate Purim. So we made it easier for the villages to come in earlier so they could sell their wares, and the people in the big cities would be able to celebrate properly. We're going to see that that's not the end answer, but at least at this point, that's what the Gemara is assuming.
I sort of interpreted it as that's the day we have lots of people there to hear us read it.
Right, exactly. Well, I think that is the reason why that they're going to allow, but the question is, why are they allowing them to come? They could come in, why not let them come in on Tuesday or Wednesday to hear the Megillah, if that's the 14th?
But they don't normally come on.
They wouldn't normally come on those days, and we're going to see that we're not going to, that eventually is the answer is that we didn't want to trouble them. Here it's making it sound like it's for the benefit of the cities, the people in the bigger cities, so they've got good food to celebrate the holiday with. In the end, we're going to find out it's actually to give a break to the villages, so they don't have to keep coming into the bigger cities.
But also Monday and Thursday, the days Torah is read in addition.
Right, exactly. And that's when they're coming in to hear Torah as well. So Anan Hachi, okay, so the Gemara explains Anan Hachi Ka'amrinan. This is what we said. This is what we meant when we asked the question. Now, all of these days when the Megillah may be read were enacted by the members of the Great Assembly, this Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, when they established the holiday of Purim itself. The Isalka Datach, if it should enter your mind to say that the members of the Great Assembly enacted only the 14th, the 15th as days for the reading of the Megillah, right? Could only be those days, because those are the days that we celebrate the holiday. Is it possible that the later sages came and uprooted an ordinance that was enacted by the members of the Great Assembly, right? So according to this, the whole idea of establishing the holiday of Purim as we have it today, according to this teaching, it comes from the days of the men of the Great Assembly, which is a very interesting concept right there. And here it says, even in the note in the background, the exact role and composition of the group known as the members of the Great Assembly is unclear. According to the opening Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, the members of the Great Assembly received the oral tradition from the prophets and served as a link in a chain of transmission going back to Moses at Mount Sinai. The assembly served as the religious leadership during the Second Temple period. The last of the prophets, including Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, are identified as being part of this group, together with Mordechai of Megillat Esther. So the reality is we don't know who these people are. It's this almost a mythic group that, as he says, as Steinsaltz points out, was a chain in the tradition between the prophets and the rabbis. And so one tradition is that Mordechai was part of that group. We have some of the last prophets being part of that group. And so they had the authority to establish the holiday of Purim, because remember, Purim is not a Torah holiday. It's a post-Torah holiday. It comes when the Jewish community is living in diaspora. And so, according to this teaching, the Great Assembly established it. They firmed up this holiday on the 14th and the 15th. And if that's so, then how, and you're saying, well, the sages were lenient and allowed them to come on the 11th. Well, you know what? That can't be, because according to Jewish law, a later court can't change what an earlier court did unless the later court was greater in number and greater in scholarship. So that can't be. So it must be that the Great Assembly had already permitted these leniencies. Rather, Ella Pshita, Kulhu Anshe Knesset Agola Takinu, Hecha Remiza. So rather, it's obvious that all these days, the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, and their special circumstances were enacted by the members of the Anshe Knesset Hagolah, the Great Assembly. And the question to be asked is, where is the allusion to this in the Bible? The Megillah itself, which was approved by the members of the Great Assembly, mentions only the 14th and 15th of Adar. So, according to Rav Shemin bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he said it in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is one of the early rabbinic sages in the land of Israel, from after the Mishnah. He's one of the first Amoraim. It's alluded in a verse in the book of Esther itself. And the verse says, L'kayem et yemei hapurim ha'ela bizmanehem, to confirm these days of Purim in their time. The phrase "in their times" indicates that they enacted many times for them, not only the 2 days. Zmanim harbe tiknu lahem. So we have, yeah.
Is it 2 days they're referring to because it might fall on Shabbos, and so they would do it on the next day?
Right. Well, more than 2 days, because the 2 days we already know are the 14th, which is when you would normally read it, and the 15th for walled cities, ancient walled cities. So you've got 2 days. But Zmanehem is more than 2 days. That's what the Rabbi Yochanan was teaching. Rav Shemin bar Abba, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that actually more than 2 days. There were lots of days that you could read it. So we're going to find out now why just the 11th, 12th, 13th, besides the 14th and 15th. Haimi ba'ile legufe. This verse is necessary for its own purpose. So this is an objection. So you said it's Zmanehem means lots of days. But the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute. The verse is necessary. You had to use that verse stands by itself. You don't have to make any more interpretations in order to teach that the days of Purim must be observed at proper times. Zmanehem is at their times. I mean, the 14th and the 15th, the day of certain days in unwalled cities and days in walled cities. Well, the Gemara responds to its own objection. If so, the verse should have said, not Zmanehem, but Zmanim. There, Zmanim Tuva. The fact that it says their days as opposed to just times, or their times, their times as opposed to times, indicates something different than it's just those 2 days. It indicates that there were many times established for the reading of the Megillah.
To whom does "there" refer?
To the days of Purim. So if it had just said, it could have just said, let me read the verse. L'kayem et yemei Purim ha'ela bizmanam, at their time. It didn't have to say their times, their seasons, or, well, I guess times is a good translation, their times, but it could have said zmanam, their time, meaning the appropriate time, the 14th of the Adar or the 15th of Adar, depending on where you lived. But they use the term Zmanehem, and according to the Gemara, that allows us to interpret it as multiple times. Okay,
I'm
well,
still unclear as to whom does there refer.
the Purim, the days of Purim should be at their time, should be on their specific time, the appropriate time. So the there is referring to the Purim itself.
Yeah, the whole discussion doesn't make sense if you take anything else as the antecedent of there.
Yeah. So here, but now the Gemara is going to object again to this use of the terminology, the akati mebaile. But still, the plural term is necessary to indicate that the time of this walled city is not the same time of that unwalled city. That is, Purim is celebrated on different days in different, this walled city is of that unwalled town, I'm sorry. Because you've got two different, so you could still use Zmanehem, would still make sense if you're talking about Shushan Purim or regular Purim. So how does your response, that's not an answer. The Gemara responds again. If so, let the verse say, their time, Zmanam. My Zmanehem. Why does it say Zmanehem? Shmat mina kulhu. Learn from this term that although the verse specifies only 2 days, the Megillah may at times be read on all of the days enumerated in the Mishnah. So what they're doing is they're arguing over how do we interpret the term L'kayem et yemei hapurima ele bizmanehem. Could you just say bizman at that time without any plural or without any what's the word I'm looking for? Without saying there, you could have said just zman at the time.
Any modifier.
Without any modifier, thank you. Without any modifier. You could have just said bizman or bizmanam. But they use the term zmanehem, and that opens the door for us to interpret that there were more than just 2 days of reading the Megillah. So then the Gemara says, well, you could have said zmanim tuva. It could have why didn't they just use the term many times as opposed to zmanehem? Because zmanehem is confusing. You're saying zmanehem means lots of different days. But zmanehem could be zmanehem dumiyad dizmanam. Ma zmanam trey, af zmanehem trey. You could that basically they're saying you're making a lot out of a little change, and that we don't agree with that. So the Gemara asks, say that these 2 days added are the 12th and the 13th of Adar. Ema tresar utlesar. Kida Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak. Shlosha asar zman kihila lekolhi, v'lo tzarich lerabuyeh. So now we get into this. Okay, well, wait a minute.
I wonder why there are so many Jewish lawyers.
Yeah. So the Gemara says, oh, look, if you wanted to add more days, you should have just said, it should have just said the 12th and the 13th of Adar. So how did they get in? Where did they get in the idea of the 11th? Because if you're adding if you're going to say, it's going to be a plural and it's 2 more days, so then they could have just said the 12th and the 13th. So the response is that the 13th actually is a time of assembly for all. This is according to a time of, let's see the note here. Rashi explains that the 13th of Adar was the day on which the Jews assembled to fight their enemies. Rav Achai Gaon understands the term, a time of assembly alludes to the fast of Esther, on which all gather in order to fast. So if this is the Gemara's intention, the earliest reference, that's the earliest attention to a fast. Okay, but the point is, which of course you can see since Rashi and Achai Gaon have different explanations, it's not so clear. But according to this Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, the 13th was a time when everybody would gather anyway, because it was either the day of battle and I guess they got together to remember the battle, or it was the day for the fast in which people gathered for the fast. And there was no need to have a special derivation to include it as a day that is fit for the reading of the Megillah, because people would have gathered on that day and they could have read it on the 13th. And so, yeah.
Is the 13th the date of the fast now?
Yeah, well, let's see, the 13th is, yeah, the day before Purim. Yeah.
Only one day?
Yeah, it's only one, right. She fasted for 3
That's
days.
enough.
The Ethiopian Jews follow that custom. They fast for 3 days, but the rest of us just fast for the day before Purim.
Well, if you focus on 3 days, it would start on the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th.
Yes, of course, that's not the Gemara's explanation. They've got, they're trying to, what they're trying to do is, they're trying to, the Gemara, which comes, of course, 100 years or more after the Mishnah, they're trying to understand, why is it limited to 11, 12, 13, as well as 14 and 15? So they've got the 12th, you wouldn't need to, the 12th and the 13th doesn't work. I'm trying to remember what just as the term their time can be understood to refer to 2 days. Right. So they're arguing, the suggestion right now is that the term Zmanehem refers to more than one extra day, 2 days. It's going to be two extra days. So the days should have been 2 days in addition to the 14th and the 15th. Then the 12th and the 13th. Well, but it says in the Mishnah the 11th. So answer number one is, well, the 13th really is a day of assembly anyway. You're not really learning anything from 2 extra days by adding the 13th. So the 13th is included as a time of assembly anyway, and the extra 2 days would be therefore the 11th and the 12th. So then the Gemara says, well, wait a minute, if you're going to add extra days, what about the 16th and the 17th? Why don't we just add 2 days at the end of after the 14th and the 15th? So they look again to text in the book of Esther, and the verse is, oh gosh, I should have, I think I had that in my notes. The verse was Velo Ya'avor, which they understand it, which means shall not pass, but they understand that you can't go past the 14th and the 15th. Should have pulled up my, I'll pull it up now. So because of a verse in the book of Esther, they interpret it as you can't go after the 15th. It's got to be the last possible day is the
15th.
The 15th. Let me just see let me just pull up here so I could look. The verse in full is, the Jews undertook and irrevocably obligated themselves and their descendants and all who might join them to observe these days in the manner, where's the Vayilo Yavor? These and all of those who might join them, and Veloya Avor. How do they translate the? And upon all, let's see, took upon the Jews ordained and took upon themselves and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them. So it should not, so that it should not fail. The loya avor, that they should. So here's the translation. The English translation is, the Jews undertook and irrevocably obligated themselves and their descendants and all who might join them to observe these 2 days in the manner prescribed at the proper time each year. No other days, at the proper time. That's how they're translating it in the English. And so the words velo ya'avor, even though it's in the middle of the verse, is that they should not be on any other days. Velo ya'avor, not any other days. These 2 days and these days alone. Of course, the Mishnah has included days prior to this. Having cited, so now that the Gemara has come up with an answer, because of the text in verse 27, you can't go beyond. They're translated basically as you can't go beyond those 2 days. We now have it, so it's the last day is the 15th. The question still is why, how did you add 11, 12, and 13? Well, we figured out that the 13th is a day of assembly anyway, and if Zmanehem means 2 additional days beyond the 2 days that are the proper days, that's 11 and 12. Let's see. So
where do you come up with 2?
Because
I mean,
because Zmanehem is plural.
yes.
And Zmanim, Zmanam, their time is what the Gemara is suggesting it could have said. When you say Zmanehem, their times means that's a plural. Times is plural, and plural means 2, more than
Really?
1. Yeah,
Really?
plural means more than 1. That's how they're interpreting it.
Yeah, more than 1 can be 50.
Of course it can, but their interpretation, they're limiting it to just 2. Now, we have to say one thing. A lot of times, the way interpretation works is it goes backwards. If you have been told by the Mishnah that the days the days for reading Megillah are 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, you have to justify how come 11, 12, and 13. So you're absolutely right. You could have translated Zmanehem as lots of days, many, it's plural, so you have 10 days. But they're limited because the Mishnah just told them the only extra days besides the 14th and 15th are 11, 12, and 13. So you now have to interpret within that context. So plural here means 2 days, and that the 13th of Adar, we've already said is a day of assembly, so you don't have to include that in your plural, which means 11 and 12. Well, what about 16 and 17? Can you go the other direction? No, because there's a verse in the book of Esther that says lo ya'avor, you don't go beyond. So that's that's their limitations.
Is the phrase lo ya'avor in our prayer book, and they translate it, shall not be transgressed?
Right. It can also mean, right. It can also mean that. Ya'avor, avor can have a lot of different, there's a lot of meanings to that term.
Isn't the sort of basic underlying meaning not crossing over?
Yeah, right. Except that's probably the origin, right? You don't cross over. So an avera is a transgression. Over is to cross or to move along. So I think that's the thrust of it. But anyway, having cited, okay, so that was Rabbi Shemin Bar Abba's opinion following Rabbi Yochanan. Now we get a different, they cites another answer to the question of where the verses allude to the permissibility of reading the Megillah on the days enumerated in the Mishnah. Now we got a different interpretation. Amar Kra, Kayamim, Asher Nachu Vahem Yehudim. So it says, again, the verse says, as the days, let me just go back to the translation here, the whole verse. We got the whole verse here. Starting with verse 20. Mordechai recorded these events and he sent dispatches to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Achashverosh, near and far, charging them to observe the 14th and 15th days of Adar every year. And here's verse 22. the same days on which the Jews enjoyed relief from their foes. Kayamim. Now, kayamim means like the days. So he says it's the, where I missed it here. Oh, here it is. Like the days. The term days, if it said yamim, is referring to the 2 days that are explicitly mentioned. Kayamim means days that are like those, the 14th and the 15th, which in this case is the 11th and the 12th. Why not the 12th and the 13th? Well, we already learned that. The 13th is already a time of assembly for all. And there's no need to have a special interpretation to fit that 13th in. It just automatically is, because the 13th was the day of assembly. It was a day when they gathered because either, according to Rashi, it a day of remembrance for the battle, or because it was the fast day. And you can't say the 16th and 17th because of the verse, Lo ya'avor, it shall not pass. It can't go beyond that day. So now we're asked, we have two possibilities here. We had two answers, right? One of them had to do with the word zmanehem, and that's the interpretation of that word. And one, kayamim, like the days, meaning like the days of the 14th to the 15th. Okay, so now we got to understand why the Gemara wants to know why they come up with different interpretations. They don't like it when there's different interpretations. How come everybody's not on the same page? Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, my tama lo amar bizmanehem. Why didn't he use that interpretation of zmanehem to come up with these extra days? And the answer is, he doesn't learn from this derivation of playing around with the word zman, zmanam, zmanehem, lo mashmalei. And he doesn't use the fact that these individual modifiers, or just the term zman, he's going to derive from that the days. For him, I guess zmanehem just means these days. He's not going to derive anything from it. Therefore, he feels more comfortable using the derivation from the word kayamim, like these days. So that meant other days. Rav Shemin bar Abba, ma'itama lo amar mikayamim. Why didn't he use the term kayamim to develop his explanation of why we can read the Megillah on the 11th, 12th, and 13th? Amar lach, he would say to you, hahu ledorot hu dichtiv. He would have said in that verse, again, I'll read that verse, the same days on which the Jews enjoyed relief from their foes, and the same month which had been transformed for them from one of grief and mourning to one of festive joy, they were to observe them as days of feasting and merrymaking. Where was the line in there for their dorot? Maybe it was a little bit before. I gotta look at the Hebrew here. The Kayamim Asher. Oh, here, well, yeah. It said in the previous verse, in verse 21, every year they were to continue to observe this. And then in verse 23, so they accepted it upon them. So according to Rav Shemin bar Abba, the verse that of verse 22, Kayamim, these days, meant these days for the future generations, for generations into the future. They were supposed to observe these days just like the days when they happened. So they interpreted those terms differently. And that's why they didn't agree with each other's interpretation.
I hope this wasn't the first instance of like those days, like this, like
right.
like.
Well, you can see how these sages are looking at the words very carefully, and they're reading them we could call them hyper literally, but they're also, as I mentioned before, they're also interpreting them within a limited context. The Mishnah's already told us what days you read. They now have to figure out the interpretation. They're trying to imagine what was the interpretation of the sages of the Mishnah to limit it to these 5 days. So in some sense, they don't able to interpret it just in any way they want. They're constrained by what the previous generations have determined. So that's another constraint on their interpretation. Okay, let's go to new topic. With regard to the Mishnah's ruling that the Megillah may be read on the day of assembly, Rabba Bar Chana said, that Rabbi Yochanan said, this is a statement of Rabbi Akiva which is unattributed. Okay, so who said? They want to know which earlier teacher taught that they could read it on the day of assembly. And it was Rabbi Akiva, because he derives halachot based on the distinction that he draws between these terms: time, their time, zman, zmanehem, zmanam. The Chachamim omrim ein korin ota ela bizmana. The sages said, though, that you can only read the Megillah at its designated time, that is the 14th. So now you have this different interpretation. Now we're learning that this Mishnah that taught you could read it on different days than the 14th and the 15th. This was an argument between Tanaim, rabbis of the Mishnaic period, that actually Rabbi Akiva, who his name is not attached to the opinion, but that Rabbi Akiva's opinion was that you could read it on the 11th, 12th, 13th, as well as the 14th and the 15th, based on his reading of these terms, Zman, Zmanam, Zmanehem. But that the majority of you, or at least the sages, I guess the majority, was that you can only read it on the appropriate days. You only read it on the 14th and the 15th. You don't move it to the 11th, 12th, and 13th, even though the Mishnah said that, but that was just one rabbi's opinion. Well, now the Gemara is going to raise an objection. So and this is based on a Baraita. They have this, if you remember from when we studied, not Tanaim, what is the word I'm looking for? Tanit. When we studied Tanit, we learned that the Mishnah is just like the authoritative text from the time of the Mishnah, from that early period, the 1st, 2nd century. It's the authoritative text, but there were a lot of different texts going around that eventually ended up being part of this compilation that Rabbi Judah Hanassi put together. But we have other parallel texts, Baraitot or Tosefta, that was put together at that same time, taught by different rabbinic schools. And a lot of times the Gemara, which did have this memory of these other parallel early texts, will bring them to the attention of the Gemara and will suggest, wait a minute, we've got a Baraita from the same time, same authority, because it comes from the same time, same authority as our official Mishnah, and the Baraita is different. Sometimes we're going to follow that parallel ruling. And in this case, they're suggesting that Rabbi Akiva, this early, another early text, Rabbi Akiva suggested these multiple days. The sage's argument was, or opinion was, no, Megillah is only read on the 14th and the 15th. So now we have another Baraita, another early parallel text in the name of Rabbi Yehuda. When is one permitted to read the Megillah from the 11th to the 15th of Adar? One may read on these dates at a time when the years are established properly and the Jewish people dwell securely in their own land. However, aval bizman hazeh, at this time, ho'ilu mistaklin ba, nowadays when people look to the reading of the Megillah and use it, this is interesting, and this is Steinsaltz adding this piece in, use it to calculate when Passover begins, one may read the Megillah only in its designated time. Ein korin ela bizmana. So this is interesting, and here's a note here that he gives us about mistaklin. According to some, the concern is that people may come to set the date of Passover according to the date on which the Megillah is read. That's which means that because Passover comes a month after Purim, almost exactly a month. Purim is on the 14th, Shushan Purim on the 15th, Passover is on the 15th of the next month, that that people might get confused if you found out that in some places they were reading on the 11th or the 12th, they might observe Passover at the wrong time. That's one possibility. The other possibility is, what does it mean that they look to the date of the Megillah reading? Others explain that the poor look to the time when the Megillah is read and expect to receive the Purim gifts for the needy at the same time, because that's one of the mitzvot for Purim. They may become distraught if the Megillah is read and they don't get their gifts on time. So it's not so clear exactly what Rabbi Yehuda means in this Baraita, but it is interesting to note that he says at one time it may be true that the Megillah was read at different times besides the 14th and the 15th because of whatever, market days, Torah reading days, when the courts were in session. But that's only at a time. That was at a special time in our history when the courts established the calendar, right? Because when there was a Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, that each month was determined by that court. And that was determined by actual sighting of the moon, of the new moon. And that's when the word would go out, okay, this month starts today. Once the people of Israel, there wasn't a court in Jerusalem, the temple was destroyed, the people were dispersed, Jews are living all over, they fell back on a fixed calendar. And so once that period of time, when the courts are not establishing the calendar by the court, and the Jewish people are not dwelling securely in their own land, we scrap that whole idea of reading on different days. We only do it on the days that are in the fixed calendar. So
Is Shushan a walled city?
yes, Shushan is a walled city. Well, we're gonna learn about Shushan. It was a walled city and it wasn't a walled city, but yes, we understand it as being a walled city, but as we saw in the Mishnah, the walled city definition comes not from the time of Esther, but from the time of Joshua. We'll get to that in a moment if we get to do it today. Okay, so that's Rabbi Yehuda. That's another Baraita. Now they look into this Baraita. Rabbi Yehuda, Aliba Daman. Who is Rabbi Yehuda following? Ilema Alima de Rabbi Akiva. If you say that he's following Rabbi Akiva's opinion, afilu bisman hazeh itala haytak kanta. If we say that it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, whose opinion is expressed in the Mishnah, that we can read it on different days, we got a problem, because as Rabbi Akiva holds that even nowadays, this ordinance would apply. You would be able to read it on different days. Okay. According to Rabbi Akiva, it's permitted for residents of villages to read the Megillah on the day of assembly. Elalav, aliba de Rabbana. Rather, this teaching of Rabbi Yehuda, this Baraita of Rabbi Yehuda, follows Rabbanan. Uvizman shehashanim ketiknan v'Yisrael shruyin al admatan mihakarena. Nevertheless, at least when the years are established properly and the Jewish people dwell securely in their land, the Megillah is read even prior to the 14th. As the sages disagree only about the halacha nowadays. So the sages so this was a little confusing. Steinzold says this contradicts the statement of Rabbi Yochanan, who holds that the Megillah could never be read earlier than the 14th. What he means here is that the sages, the contradiction is that the sages are saying, yes, once upon a time, the Megillah was read. Once upon a time, the Megillah could have been read on different days, But Rabbi Yochanan had stated in that teaching earlier by Rav Shemin. Where is it here? Rav Shemin. I think it was Rav Shemin. Wasn't it Rabbi Yochanan?
Right there, you just passed it.
Oh,
You just
yeah.
passed.
But I wanted to see where he said Rabbi Shemin in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Right up here.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
One
yeah,
higher,
where
one
is it?
higher.
Yeah, no, it's right here. Rabbi Shimon said is alluded to in the verse to confirm these days. But wait, where is it that the sages? All right, well, we'll just follow here. The statement, the contradiction is the understanding that Rabbi Yochanan held that the Megillah could never be read before the 14th. But according to the sages, that's not true. It could have been read before the 14th at a time when Israel was dwelling in the land of Israel and all the Jewish people were securely in their land, and they were, and the calendar was being determined by the court, the Sanhedrin. So the notion that the sages held that it could never be read earlier, which is what Rabbi Yochanan had taught, but it was somewhere up here. All right, well, it doesn't make a difference. That was refuted. Okay. So we have here, who does Rabbi Yehuda follow? If Rabbi Yehuda follows that the sages that if Rabbi Yehuda is following the sages, then this teaching that the Megillah can only be read at its designated time doesn't work, because he's suggesting that at one time they could have read it at an earlier time than the 14th. If it's Rabbi Akiva holds that, oh, here it is. This is the Rabbi Yochanan statement. According to Rabbi Yochanan, Akiva held that we can read that the Mishnah follows Rabbi Akiva and not the sages, because the sages hold that it can only be read on the 14th and the 15th. If Rabbi Yehuda holds by Rabbi Akiva, that can't be, because he just said, nowadays we don't follow that. So it can't be, he's not following Rabbi Akiva in the Baraita. And how could he be holding by the sages who say you could only read on the 14th and 15th? Because he says that you could possibly, there may come a time when we can read the Megillah earlier if the Jews are living securely in their own land and if the calendar is being established by the courts. So we seem to have a dilemma here. And that Rabbi Yochanan's, yeah.
How can you say this is confusing? I don't understand.
Yeah. Okay. So now we have, okay, so a lot of times when we have this kind of refutation, we have this confusion, the sages are going to go back and say, you know what, you read it incorrectly. Here's the correct version of the previous passage. Rabbi Bar Chana said, Rabbi Yochanan said, this is the statement of Rabbi Akiva, which was unattributed. However, the sages said nowadays, since people look to the reading of the Megillah and use it to calculate, or whatever that means, since they look to the reading of the Megillah, one may only read it at its designated time. And then Rabbi Yehuda agrees with the sages. Because what the sages see, the difference between the original Rabbi Yochanan statement and this one is the word nowadays. Nowadays, we've changed it because historically things are different. The Gemara comments then the Baraita fits with the sage's opinion. At a time when the years are established properly and the Jewish people dwell securely in their own land, you could read the Megillah on these market days that came before the 14th and the 15th. However, nowadays, since people look to the reading of the Megillah, either to calculate when Passover comes because they know it's a month later, or because that's when the poor are looking to get their financial benefits, and they're going to be disappointed if it doesn't come at its proper time, at the time of the reading of Megillah. Therefore, we erase the confusion for the poor, or we erase the confusion about when Passover begins. We only read Megillah at the proper time. We only read it on the 14th and the 15th. And now everything lines up. Rabbi Yehuda's statement is consistent with the opinion of the sages as cited by Rabbi Yochanan in this second version. And then Rav Ashi kashele de Rabbi Yehuda ad Rabbi Yehuda. But Rav Ashi opposes the difficulty on the apparent contradiction between the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in the Baraita and a ruling which we're going to cite a little bit later in a Mishnah. In accordance with opinion, and he establishes the Baraita in accordance with, where he establishes the Baraita in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda rather than Rabbi Yehuda. What? Rav Ashi poses to. Okay, well, let's get to the meat of it. The Gemara explains the apparent contradiction. Did Rabbi Yehuda actually say that nowadays, since people look to the reading of the Megillah and use it to calculate when Passover begins, one may read the Megillah only at its designated time? The Gemara raises a contradiction from a Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda said, when is one permitted to read the Megillah from the 11th of Adar? In a place where the villagers generally enter town on Monday and Thursday. However, in a place where they do not generally enter town on Monday and Thursday, one may read the Megillah only in its designated time, the 14th of Adar. The Mishnah indicates that at least in a place where villagers enter a town on Monday and Thursdays, one may read the Megillah from the 11th, even nowadays. And due to this contradiction, Rav Ashi establishes a Baraita in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. Okay, so this is what they were saying before. We have these two statements by a guy named Rabbi Yehuda. According to a Baraita, you only know there's only a certain time when we could read the Megillah before the 14th and the 15th, but nowadays we don't. In a Mishnah coming up on 5a, on page 5a of the Talmud, Rabbi Yehuda says that there are times when you do read it before the 14th and 15th in places where villagers generally enter town. And there are times when you never read it on before the 14th and 15th. It's a area where villagers don't enter into town on Monday and Thursday. Rav Ashi said this is a contradiction of Rabbi Yehuda versus Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore that second opinion has to be a different guy, Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. The Gemara is, let's see, how far did I go? I don't want to see where should I end here.
I think we should bar none.
Yeah, I think we should stop right now. We should go because it's already 12:08. So let's just finish this passage, and we'll get to why the walls are surrounded by from the time of Yehoshua next time. So we'll just finish up here. So the Gemara expresses surprise. Rav Ashi posed a difficulty due to the apparent contradiction between the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in the Baraita and the opinion of a Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah. And so therefore he says that no, it's really Rabbi Yossi. And why is he allowed to amend the text that way? In general, we don't like it when we have a contradiction. The Gemara doesn't like it when you just willy-nilly say, well, it must have been somebody else. Because they like to figure out these contradictions and they don't like to amend text that way. But in this case, we're given a leniency because Rav Ashi heard that there were those who taught the Baraita in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, and there were those who taught the Baraita in the name of Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. So therefore, he said, since the Baraita seems to be, there were two traditions of who taught the Baraita of up above that we had over here.
Is a Baraita kind of an official opinion?
No, the Baraita Baraita literally means outside text. It's a text that it's contemporary with the Mishnah, has similar authority, but it's not in the official Mishnah. So the Baraita, so in some sense, you want the Baraita, this material, to be consistent with the Mishnah. And in the Mishnah, you have a statement by Rabbi Yehuda that seems to contradict a Baraita that was taught in the name of Rabbi Yehuda. And as I said, the Gemara doesn't like to say, well, because you have this contradiction, it must be teaching something. They don't usually just say, well, okay, it must be some different guy. But in this case, Rav Ashi has a little bit of a leniency there because he had learned it. There were two traditions of that Baraita. One came from Rabbi Yehuda, and one came from a Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. You can see where the confusion would be. One was Rabbi Yehuda, and one was a guy whose father was named Yehuda. And since he had learned that these traditions came down in different, this Baraita came down in two different traditions, he felt he had the authority to say, well, the way we solve the contradiction is that actually one Baraita was taught by Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, a separate person than who the Mishnah that we're about to learn in a few pages, where that came from. So he gave himself the authority to solve the contradiction by saying they were two different people. Usually the Gemara doesn't like to do that. But let's stop here, so that we got a new section, and it goes a little bit farther. Wow, okay, I have to speed this up. All right, well, anyway, okay. So this, sorry for all the confusion, but it is a little bit confusing here. The trying to make sense of these teachings that the Gemara, that obviously in the time of the Gemara, they understood that the only days you read Megillah were on the 14th and the 15th. And here the Mishnah is telling us you could read it on earlier days. And they're trying to figure out, well, how does that work? They do have earlier material that coincides with these opinions of earlier readings on earlier days, and they're trying to make sense of it, of why it was possible at one time. And so the conclusion seems to be that there was a time in Jewish history when reading on the 11th, the 12th, or the 13th for certain communities was acceptable. But that time has passed. And we now only read it on the 14th and the 15th. And next we're going to get into why do we read it on the 15th? Why do some places read it on the 15th? Okay. Oof.
If the 14th falls on Shabbos, is the 15th both Shushan and the regular reading?
According to the Mishnah, if the 14th fell on Shabbat, no. If the 14th, according to the Mishnah, if the 14th fell on Shabbat, you would move the reading of the 14th up to Thursday, and everybody in unwalled cities reads it on the Thursday, the 12th, and the walled cities, you would read it on the 15th. If the 15th was Shabbat, the people in the walled cities move it up a day. That's the only time that they move it up a day. So, but anyway, all right. So let's end here, and we'll stop the recording here.